Hello again, 102. To conclude Eisenhower's foreign policy, basically in his second administration, and we'll pick up now with the Geneva Accords, and they refused to sign them because the American and South Vietnamese representatives argued that these treaties legitimized the communist victory. And after 1954, Ho Chi Minh then took complete control of the government in North Vietnam, and he executed thousands of Vietnamese that he deemed opponents. And in South Vietnam, power gravitated to a new premier chosen by the French at American urging, Ngo Dinh Diem, a Catholic nationalist who had opposed both the French and the Viet Minh. And in 1954, Eisenhower began providing military and economic aid to Diem. The U.S. president remained opposed to the use of U.S. combat troops, believing that military intervention would lead to a costly stalemate, as indeed it eventually did. Diem's autocratic efforts to eliminate all opposition played into the hands of the communists, who found eager recruits among the discontented South Vietnamese. And by 1957, communist guerrillas known as the Viet Cong, or VC Charlie, were launching attacks on the Diem government. As the warfare intensified, the Eisenhower administration concluded that its only option was to sink or swim with Diem. And there is the Viet Cong defined. They were the ones who were the guerrilla fighters against the South Vietnamese government. In 1954, Eisenhower had used what he called the falling domino theory to explain why the United States needed to fight communism in Vietnam. You have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is the certainty that it will go over very quickly. So if South Vietnam were to fall to communism, he predicted, the rest of Southeast Asia would soon follow. Right? So this is, if one country goes down, all the neighboring countries would necessarily follow suit. And this is a big reason for many U.S. actions from this time up through the early 1990s. The domino analogy, originally used by President Truman and echoed by Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, assumed that communism was a monolithic global movement directed by Soviet leaders in Moscow. Yet, anti-colonial insurgencies such as those in Southeast Asia resulted more from nationalist motives than communist ideology. The domino analogy also meant that the United States must police the entire world to ensure that the dominoes, no matter how small, did not begin falling. As a consequence, every insurgency around the world mushroomed into a strategic crisis. And this is post-war alliances. It's cut off here at the top. Here you have the communist world in orange or red. You have defense agreements signed with South Korea, Japan, and South Vietnam. And the purple are SEATO countries, Southeast Asia Treating Organization countries. This was an attempt by Dulles to recreate NATO in the Pacific, and it doesn't work very well. And unfortunately, we are still defending Taiwan and South Korea up until the present time. The 7th Fleet exists for that reason. Repression in Hungary. On October 23, 1956, Hungarian nationalists, encouraged by American propaganda broadcasts through Radio Free Europe, revolted against the communist troops in Budapest. The Soviets responded by sending 500,000 soldiers and 4,000 tanks into Hungary, where they killed thousands of Hungarian freedom fighters before installing a new puppet government. And Eisenhower offered his sympathy to the Hungarian people, but did nothing more. His strategy in dealing with such crisis was, he later said, take a hard line and bluff. That's the reality of massive retaliation and rollback. Although he avoided a war over Soviet suppression of democracy in Hungary, Eisenhower had allowed administration officials, especially Secretary of State Dulles, to make reckless pledges about rolling back communism and liberating the nations of Eastern Europe. To all those suffering under communist slavery, Dulles promised, "Let us say you can count on us." But unfortunately, the Hungarian freedom fighters, their rebellion was quashed. And unfortunately, that theory then, as the late 50s rolled around really didn't have much effect anymore. But Eisenhower was much more successful in Suez, which was going on at the same time in Egypt as the revolt in Hungary. And in 1952, an Egyptian army officer, Gamal Abdel Nasser, had overthrown King Farouk, and once in power, Nasser set out to become the leader of the entire Arab world. And to do so, he promised to destroy the new Israeli nation created in 1948. Nasser, with Soviet support, first sought control of the Suez Canal, the crucial international waterway in Egypt connecting the Mediterranean and Red Seas. The canal had opened in 1869 as a joint French-Egyptian venture, and from 1882 on, British troops had protected the canal as the British Empire's lifeline to India and its other Asian colonies. When Nasser's nationalist regime pressed for the withdrawal of British forces, an Anglo-Egyptian treaty provided for British withdrawal within 20 months. In 1955, Nasser, adept at playing both sides in the Cold War, announced a huge arms deal with the Soviet Union. So the United States countered by offering to help Egypt finance a massive hydroelectric dam at Aswan on the Nile River. And in 1956, when Nasser increased trade with the Soviet bloc and recognized the People's Republic of China, Dulles abruptly canceled the offer to fund the Aswan Dam. It'll eventually get completed with other funding sources. Unable to retaliate directly against the United States, Nasser seized control of the Suez Canal Company and denied access to Israeli-bound ships. The British and the French were furious. On October 29, 1956, while Hungarian rebels were battling Soviet tanks, Israeli, British, and French forces invaded Egypt. Nasser responded by sinking all 40 of the international ships then in the Suez Canal, and a few days later, Anglo-French commandos and paratroopers took control of the canal. To defuse the crisis, Eisenhower adopted a bold stance. He put America's armed forces on alert around the world and warned Soviet diplomats that the United States would go to war if the communist superpower tried to intervene. Then the president shocked Americans by demanding that the British and French withdraw their troops from the Suez Canal and that the Israelis evacuate the Sinai Peninsula or face severe economic sanctions. That the three aggressor nations grudgingly complied with a ceasefire agreement on November 7th testified to Eisenhower's strength, influence, and savvy in dealing with military matters. And they were forced to withdraw. And eventually the Egyptians took control of the canal zone. And these are the post-war alliances in Europe, North Africa, and the Mideast. This is the Communist bloc. This is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the collective security of Western Europe and any of the other members who have joined. This is the Arab League that Nasser hoped to control with his new country at the time called the United Arab Republic. It's still Egypt, but that was what it was called under Nasser. And reactions to Sputnik. On October the 4th, 1957, the Soviets shocked the world when they announced the launch of the first communications satellite called Sputnik, or Traveling Companion. Americans panicked at the news. More bomb shelters! The Soviet success in space dealt a severe blow to the prestige of American science and technology, which had seemed unquestionably preeminent since the Second World War. It also changed the military balance of power, because if the Soviets had such advanced rocketry, many people reasoned, then perhaps they could hit U.S. cities with nuclear missiles. Democrats charged that the Soviets had humiliated the United States, and they launched a congressional investigation to assess the new threat to the nation's security. And Sputnik mania led the United States to increase defense spending and establish a crash program to enhance science education. And in 1958, Congress created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, to coordinate research and development related to outer space. That same year, Congress, with Eisenhower's support, enacted the National Defense Education Act, which authorized massive federal grants to colleges and universities to enhance education and research into mathematics, science, and modern languages, as well as for student loans and fellowships. The NDEA provided more financial aid to higher education than any other previous legislation. The Eisenhower Doctrine. In 1958, Congress approved what came to be called the Eisenhower Doctrine, a resolution that promised to extend economic and military aid to Arab nations and to use armed force if necessary to assist any such nation against communist aggression. And when Lebanon appealed to the United States to help fend off an insurgency, Eisenhower dispatched 5,000 Marines into the country. And in October 1958, once the situation had stabilized, U.S. forces up to 15,000 at one point finally withdrew. Nikita Khrushchev has come to power in the Soviet Union. Stalin died in 1953, and eventually Khrushchev wins the power struggle with Grigory Malenkov and becomes premier in 1955. And here he's speaking about Berlin. What are they going to do about the divided city of Berlin, over 100 miles inside the communist East German country? And in September of 1959, Khrushchev and Eisenhower agreed that the time was right for a summit meeting of the two leaders. And the U-2 summit, as it came to be called, blew up in Eisenhower's face, because on Sunday morning, May the 1st, 1960, he learned that a Soviet rocket had brought down a U.S. spy plane called the U-2, flying at 70,000 feet, some 1,200 miles inside the Soviet border. Khrushchev, embarrassed by the ability of U.S. spy planes to enter Soviet airspace, sprang a trap on Eisenhower. At first, the Soviets announced that they had only shot down a plane, and the U.S. government, not realizing they had captured the pilot, who was supposed to take a cyanide pill and kill himself in such a situation, they lied about the incident, claiming that it was a missing weather monitoring plane over Turkey. Khrushchev then disclosed that they had the American pilot, Francis Gary Powers, alive and kicking. Now the world knew that Eisenhower had lied, and on May the 11th, he abandoned efforts to cover up the incident, acknowledging that we will now just have to endure the storm. Rather than blame others, Eisenhower took personal responsibility for the spying, explaining that such illegally obtained intelligence information was crucial to national security. And at a testy summit meeting in Paris 5 days later, Khrushchev lectured Eisenhower for 45 minutes before walking out. The U-2 incident sent back efforts to reduce Cold War tensions in Berlin and worldwide. Later in 1962, Francis Gary Powers would be exchanged for a captured Soviet spy. And Khrushchev comes to power in Cuba after fighting and winning the battle over the Batista regime. And this was the greatest embarrassment to Eisenhower, because Castro is a communist, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And one of his last acts as president was to suspend diplomatic relations with Castro's Cuba. And then he also authorized a secret CIA operation to train a force of Cuban refugees to oust Castro. Yet the final decision on the use of the anti-Castro invasion force would rest with the next president, John F. Kennedy. And Eisenhower's farewell address to the American people focused on a topic never before addressed by a public official: the threat posed to government integrity by an immense military establishment that had grown out of the Second World War and the large arms industry. As a much celebrated military leader, it was all the more striking for Eisenhower to highlight the dangers of a huge military-industrial complex, exerting unwarranted influence in Congress and the White House. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist, he warned. Eisenhower confessed that his greatest disappointment was that he could affirm only that war has been avoided, not that a lasting peace is in sight.